it was a few weeks before Christmas. Students had gone home, everyone was, hanging out, not really doing very much, and suddenly, bang, it just went up.
Emergency broadcast number 3, this one is. You are listening to 4ZZZ FM Public Radio 102.1 on the dial. However, we are not transmitting from our studios in St. Lucia.
Only because there's people that are stopping us from doing so.
Yes, but we've been sneaky this morning because they've been very sneaky this morning.
I got a call at just after 4 o'clock in the morning.
I heard over the radio station, they were broadcasting it.
Jumped in my mum's car and drove to ZZZ, and by then they'd already taken over the station.
Come down, there's something going on.
And there's a group that went up to the transmitter.
With a super scope that we had that was set up to play a loop.
And so they were broadcasting from the super scope up on the mountain, basically saying to people, get your butts out to St. Lucia because they're trying to shut us down.
So what we need you to do now is we need you to come out to the station and show your support, and we'd like you to make a phone call as well, David. David's just in shock. It's a pretty horrible thing to wake up to.
4:30 in the morning, you're waking up to this. It's incredible. It's actually happened. What we've been under threat for the last 6 months or so has actually happened. The student union are literally trying to take over the station.
People just came from everywhere. People were travelling from different parts of southeast Queensland to be there. It was awesome. Like suddenly there's huge crowds.
The security guards have hit a number of people.
Angry scenes at Queensland University today after the Students' Union closed down radio station 4ZZZ. Staff and supporters of the Radical FM station grouped outside the campus studio to protest the closure, alleging harassment by the union.
And we were just so busy trying to survive the eviction. We had no money. We were bleeding people. We were struggling just to keep our heads above water. And suddenly we saw this steamroller coming towards us.
This is From A to Triple Z, an original 4ZZZ podcast series diving into the station's archives to explore the patchwork past, cultural significance, and incredible stories of Brisbane community radio 4ZZZ. I'm Max Rowley, and this episode is about a nighttime raid.
Victoria has now left the premises.
An existential crisis.
For ZZZ, which was already having an existential crisis, it was just piling another existential crisis on top of it.
And a theft.
And on top of that, then Triple J decided they wanted to do the same as us.
This is how Triple J stole the Hottest 100.
Well, I wouldn't say steal. I would say, borrowed the idea.
Everybody knew the Hottest 100 was ZZZ's, and even they knew.
And that's where we laid it on the line to them and said, look, we're going to go to court. I don't think we had the money to pay for that, or I don't think we had I don't think we even had lawyers to take them on.
The story begins in 1980. Andy Neal had just finished uni. He was young, political, and looking for a job.
And I'd been in the last year of high school when what was then called Double J started in Sydney. And Double J was fantastic because they played all this music that commercial radio had never played. They had fun comedy bits. They had journalists that did different political reporting to what you got in the mainstream media. And while I'd thought Double J was fantastic in Sydney, when I heard Triple Z in Brisbane at the time, I just thought, wow, how good is this radio station?
Andy had gotten a taste for the station while on holiday up north.
And Triple Z was just playing the best music. And the politics on air was absolutely fantastic.
Which was important. At the time, Queensland was under the grip of the conservative Bjelke-Petersen government.
And particularly when you had Joh Bjelke-Petersen here with this pressure cooker of oppression over everybody, Triple Z was communications central for the resistance.
Righto, you kids. I heard you swearing. I'm putting you away.
And it didn't take long for Andy to get immersed in Queensland culture. Well, police culture.
You know, heard about Right to March Street March that was on via Triple Z. got myself arrested walking out of King George Square across Adelaide Street up Albert Street with my mate who I, got immersed in Queensland.
Street marches were banned by the government as part of a widespread crackdown on civil liberties. But that's a whole other story. If you want to hear more about the riots, protests and police intimidation back then, and Triple Z journos bent on exposing the murky underbelly of Queensland politics, go back to the first episode of this podcast. Good morning, Mr. Peterson. Anyway, back to Andy.
Yeah, so I was in love with Triple Z, and so when I actually saw a job advertised there, it was like, wow. And, caught the overnight train up from Sydney to do the interview with about a dozen people sitting around grilling me for over 2 hours on every aspect of music and politics, and then had to do a graveyard shift to prove I could do it, and went back to Sydney and got rung up a week later to say I got the job. And it was an amazing time, and probably, as far as creative freedom goes, was probably still the best job I ever had. That was the most fun, with the most creative freedom and the most personal control over what I did.
And that's a pretty big statement for a guy who went on to shape the course of radio in this country. But we'll get to that later. Working at Z, Andy says the station had a real professional ethos. It was the early 80s though, and they knew how to have fun.
And, people would come into the station sometimes because the audience loved the station, and people would come in and, oh, we just bought you in this bag of grass, or somebody, donated this, oh, we've got this old car that's still got a few months rego on it, do you want it? Sure, okay. And so, Vince the Valiant.
And driving around in Vince the Valiant, the dial was always glued to 102.1 FM for Triple Z.
You never changed the dial because you got everything. You got better quality news of what was really going on in the world than what you got in the ABC. You had the best music soundtrack. You had local information about every gig that was on in town that night or what was happening, and there was no reason to change the dial.
And while Andy was working there, he made a discovery.
I was looking through an old Radio Times and saw this thing about, the Hot 100 or whatever, and talked to Ann Jones about what was this, and I said, oh, that sounds great, I'll start that up.
The first Hot 100 had been in 1976, and so Andy started it up again at the end of 1980.
And you had to vote for 100 songs. you voted for 100 songs, and you'd write them out and send them in. Whoever's 100 songs had the most 100 songs, the same as what was in the 100, would win a prize. And yeah, so it was a big event. It was certainly, and that was a lot to basically have me go through and manually write down names of songs.
It was popular, and so Andy did another. But after 2 years and 2 Hot 100s, Andy's contract was up and it was time for a change. He went back to Sydney and got a job with what was now called Triple J, back then a Sydney-only station.
It felt like a step sideways, I'd say, rather than a step up, because you got paid better. Like, even though we were reasonably paid at Triple Z, as I said at the time, it was higher rate of pay and much more resources.
A few others had already made the same move prior to Andy, and Triple Z had a good rep down south.
You did have John Woods and Stuart Matchett in the studio down there, and people from Triple Z did have, a real edge because it had been honed and sharpened against Joe Bjelke-Peterson.
As a young man, Laurie Zion remembers hearing Stuart Matchett on Triple J as he was driving up from Melbourne.
Once I got past Goulburn, I put on the call sign for the station and really hoped that the crackle would turn into something I could really tune into. And it was one of those drives, I think, that I remember listening to a program and someone rang up and made some kind of homophobic joke. And I just remember that the announcer, who I think was the late and great Stuart Matchett, just cutting them off and saying, oh, we don't actually think that sort of humour's funny. And, in the era we live in now, it might be hard to really give a sense of just what a revolutionary rejoinder that sounded like then, that someone was being pulled up for doing something that was in really poor taste, but that the station itself had the confidence and the announcers had the ability to still be doing, really fun radio, but to actually be able to say, well, I'm sorry, but this is unacceptable.
Fast forward a few years, and Laurie had gotten a 3-month traineeship at Triple J. It was 1988, and the ABC had decided they were going to restructure the station.
At the time, Triple J had been in about a 5-year audience decline, and they decided that every job in the station had to be re-advertised and refill it and restructured. And I basically wrote in a job application that, the opening paragraph was something like, let's face it, unless you do something radical, you're going to close Triple J down in 18 months.
Andy's argument basically came down to this.
It wasn't getting that younger audience. It wasn't getting the audience out in the suburbs. The youngest person in the station was 25 and they were the station receptionist. Musically, the programming wasn't as diverse as it could have been. And my analogy was commercial radio was just like a sponge cake. Triple J should have been like a really rich fruit cake full of all these different little bits of nuts and different bits of dried fruit and goodies and, a bit of rum mixed in there or whatever. But at the time, Triple J was like, the fruit cake was all clumpy and stuff was clumped together, whereas we wanted to have a much more diverse, mixed in fruit cake. And so that was the kind of programming policy analogy I think I used at the time.
The vision, fruitcake.
Yeah. And Andy got the job. Meanwhile, back at Z, there'd been a real exodus towards the end of the 80s.
Triple Z was financially pretty screwed when I got there. Like the heyday, it was living off its good rep.
Stefan Armbruster started volunteering at Z in 87. By then, the money had dried up and they'd gone from 14 full-time staff to living off the dole. Z had seen better days.
For me, it wasn't. I was just there going, wow, I'm here at Triple Z. This is awesome. It's going off. But once I'd been there for a while, I ended up being company director at 19 because they needed someone to put their name down, and I had no idea what it meant, but it sounded cool. So they put my name down, so I was recorded in Company's House as the company director. I had no idea what the legal implications or anything of that was.
It had been forgotten a bit, if we're realistic.
Anita Greenhill.
It was down in the studio theatre and down under the Chanel, and it had lost a lot of its listenership. And I think the student union thought it, and the political feeling at that time, they thought it would be fairly easy.
It wasn't. After occupying the station for around 10 hours, Union President Victoria Brazel and members of her newly elected Conservative Party were escorted from the studios.
Victoria is being ushered through with security guards. The security guards are continuing to hit people as they go through. The students, although they're shouting resign and are quite angry, are not touching Victoria or hurting her. Victoria has now left the premises with the security guards.
But they weren't giving up that easy.
Despite a day of peace talks, a question mark still hangs over the future of Queensland University radio station 4ZZZ. Yesterday there was a reprieve after the Students' Union tried to shut down the station, but there could be another move to close it next week.
An unintended consequence of the Student Union's failed attempt to shut down Z was an outpouring of support for the station, including from former staff who'd moved on to Triple J.
To me, they were heroes. Like they were heroes on the airwaves. So I'd been listening to them since I was a kid, and a lot of them had left and moved to Triple J in the years between when I was listening as a 14-year-old and when I eventually ended up at Z as an 18-year-old. So I knew their voices. I knew a bit of their personalities. And when we got shut down, they were there. There was people who came up from Sydney. They were offering us support. They were broadcasting about what was happening to us. They organised the joint effort at the Paddington RSL to raise money for us. They wanted us to survive. They were willing us to survive.
Meanwhile, afraid of another late night raid, Stefan and others were camping out at the station, and upstairs student newspaper offices also under threat.
quite a lot of people ended up living in the station.
I slept for I don't know how many nights in the old library.
Anita Greenhill joined Zed during the eviction.
When I heard that it was under attack, that's why I thought, oh, no, that can't be right. We've got to get involved.
We were sleeping there overnight. We basically had a 24-hour occupation of our own station.
It just didn't seem to stop.
And it was quite a mad party in a way that was going on in amongst all of this. But a lot of people at the same time were burning out. There was a core of people who were working really hard to keep this all going, but you can't run on empty for that long before you start hitting walls and crashing. Yeah.
And the student union was set on kicking Zed off campus. And eventually they succeeded. Zed was given an eviction notice.
Well, we knew it was going to happen, and it did. The right-wing dominated student union executive finally called a council meeting to ratify the eviction notice issued to Triple Z on the 22nd of December. It was a farce.
And while they put up a fight, it was dawning on them that they would have to leave.
There was no contesting it effectively. We had no grounds. We had no piece of paper that actually gave us a lease. There was talk that there was a piece of paper, and there's all these mythical things that used to exist that people talked about, but the documentation was really quite poor, and some people probably would have hoped that it would have been the end of us, that it would have caused us to shut down, but they didn't know how determined we were that we weren't going to be shut down.
And so, Stefan, Anita and others set about finding the station a new home.
And we didn't have elders, really. The day-to-day stuff was done all by a bunch of kids. We were teenagers and early 20s. We're just making stuff up. So we're looking at houses. We couldn't find a house. We couldn't afford a house.
And so, as a temporary fix, they found the next best thing.
So we got this beat-up old caravan that we could drag up to Mount Cootha. That was a mission in itself, like fitting out this caravan and getting, being able to broadcast from the mountain.
Yeah, anyone who did do shows at the hut, we'll talk about it, how dark and scary it was.
And eventually, in desperation, we signed a lease on the Toowong building.
And it was very cheap, like peppercorn for 3 years.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, we just had to do something. It was really. We didn't want to. It was that or nothing.
We didn't. We wanted the smallest lease we could possibly get, because we knew it wasn't ideal, because it was just an office space, glass window at the front, and just a big shell empty.
I don't know why they let us sign a lease for that place.
We had ages where we only had the studio, and then the rest of the whole place was boxes and boxes of records.
And I left during the Toowong years. Toowong was awful. Toowong was it was like a pressure cooker. It was too small for what we were, and we were really getting, it was hand to mouth existence. We didn't know, what was going to happen to us. We were really living day to day.
And as this is happening, Triple J announces they'll be going national.
A big day in radio right across Australia. The day that Triple J links up with Melbourne from Sydney and soon right around Australia.
We'd just been kicked off campus. We had no money. We were in the Toowong studios, which was just a shit show. And suddenly we saw this steamroller coming towards us. And here we were, tiny little Triple Z, basically a street kid in its path. And we really felt threatened. And it wasn't that we were anti-Triple J. These were our mates who were working down there. We had the same outlook on many things at that time for what it was, because this was driven from further up. This was politically driven by ABC management and by the federal government, though the federal government wasn't tipping any money into the ABC to do it.
We got the transmitters. We had no extra money. I had the same budget as the Sydney station to go national with.
That's right. Andy Neal had just become manager of Triple J.
And, I think I'd started as station manager and I'd been there about 2 weeks. And one of the people that was there was a trainee who was from Melbourne called Laurie Zion, and came to me and said, "Oh, Andy, can I have a meeting with you?" "Oh, yeah, come on. What do you want to talk about?"
I kind of wrote down a few bullet points on a piece of paper.
He goes, "Oh, I think we should maybe try doing a top 100 like the Billboard 100.
Where we polled listeners about what their favourite songs were.
And I said something like, funny you should mention that, Laurie.
For Laurie, the idea had come from 2 magazine articles. The first was Rolling Stone, a critics' poll of the 100 greatest songs of the last 25 years. And in the top 20, all but 2 songs were from the 60s.
And it kind of seemed odd to me that in 1988, what did you have to do, in terms of songs in the 80s to get into a list like that?
That's when Laurie was flicking through Triple J's library and read an article in New York street paper, The Village Voice. It was by a journalist called Barry Walters.
And he really made the argument that personal whim was everything. It's what you like that matters. And that's the point of popular music, not what critics tell you is the best. And that's kind of how I've thought about music in my life as well, and it really resonated with me.
And all this made Laurie curious. Had the station had a listener poll before?
And I asked, and the answer was no. And I got the sense that there was an element within the station that was concerned about what a listener poll might reveal. And the big fear was that it would turn up with a number one, like Stairway to Heaven or something like that, that wasn't necessarily what the station felt represented what they were doing.
But Laurie took the idea to Andy anyway.
And promoting it, make it really clear that what we want is people to be, what we call now maybe guilty pleasures, to really just own up to what they like. And he just kind of said, yeah, I love it.
Because, it had been really successful in Brisbane. And I said, we should call it the Hot 100, not the Top 100, because the Hot 100 sounds a lot better than Top 100. And, you can run it.
And so I guess then it became a question of, okay, what's the logistics and how will we do it? And I do remember at one point Andy suggesting I use an exercise book.
And Laurie then, with people in the kind of computer side of the R&D, came up with some program for helping, calculate the results instead of doing it by hand like I had.
At the time, I think the station had either 1 or 2 computers, and there were 30 or 40 people working there.
But even with a computer, they didn't have a program to count the votes.
So there was a guy in IT who we got in touch with at the ABC called Bert, and we basically had to go to him and say, can you design us a program that can actually tabulate votes that are coming in?
While Laurie had only intended for Triple J's Hot 100 to be a one-off, like Zed's, it was a real success. And so they did another the next year, as Triple J was rolling out nationally.
They weren't actually on air in Brisbane at that time yet. They'd gone national in other places in Australia, but not in Brisbane. But they obviously promoting it on air, and we'd heard about it, and yeah, we weren't impressed.
The Hot 100 was still going up in Brisbane, and it had been all but 1 year since 1980 when Andy Neal started it up again.
We were it in Brisbane at the time. There was nothing else to listen to in terms of alternative music. So everyone who listened to Zed knew the Hot 100 was coming up. Everyone was, mailing their Hot 100 in. And, you didn't have anywhere else where you could hear this music. So, everyone was interested to see what everyone else liked and what the consensus number one was.
And so, when they heard about Triple J's Hot 100, they were pissed off.
They posed all these other threats to us, and then on top of everything else, it was like, well, and now they're doing a Hot 100, but that's ours.
That was funny, actually, because everybody knew the hottest 100 was Triple Z's, and even they knew.
Some of the Triple Z people who were in Sydney, they're saying, well, we created the Hot 100 and we're just doing it on a different station. But it was like, well, no, you're doing it on a station that's also going to then be competing with us here.
I ended up I wrote a letter and threatened them that this was our intellectual property, that they needed to not use Hot 100, or they needed to acknowledge. And they tried to do it at exactly the same time, which was the really thing that annoyed us. Back
then, the ABC offices were across the road in Toowong, and so they set up a meeting with them.
And that's where we laid it on a line to them and said, look, we're going to go to court.
Certainly, maybe they talked about legal action. They didn't take any.
We couldn't get them to back down. They knew they were bigger. But we had a good fight for a while.
We were fighting for what was ours, and that's what we threatened to do. And I don't know what they decided, but They decided to slightly change the name and put an est on the end of it, and we won.
Did that feel like winning though?
No, not really. No, but it was. What else could we do? Yeah.
We were realistic about who we were, and they knew who they were. They had a national licence. We were nothing compared to that. So we just shook hands and moved on with it. And they'd never been really hostile to us. Okay, the most hostile thing was using the hottest 100, but you can see it's a good idea. You can see why they'd want to do it, I mean.
One of the episodes we actually were thinking of calling How Triple J Stole the Hottest 100.
Sure.
What would you say to that?
I wouldn't say steal. I would say, I guess, borrowed the idea. And at that stage, when we did start it, we hadn't got permission to go national, and Triple J was in a different city. And again, it was something I was going to get round to doing anyway. But Laurie came up and said, "Hey, what about we do this top 100?" And as I said, "Oh, well, funny about that, Laurie."
I mean, I'd never been to Brisbane and I'd never heard the station. So that was, so really I wasn't, at that time I wasn't aware of any kind of controversy. And if I had been aware, I would have acknowledged that.
And it was a fantastic idea, and I think it did start at Triple Z, and it's gone on to become a major Australian cultural institution.
Though it did take a while to smooth out the edges. Triple J's first 3 countdowns were all-time polls, so you could pick any song from any year. And for the first 2 years, 4 of the top 5 songs were the same, albeit in a slightly different order. Also, it seems, with countdowns come controversies, at least in Zed's case.
There was always bullshit about, that was rigged. No, that band shouldn't have been in there at all. What are you going to do? How are you going to weed out who's basically, stacking the system and who's not? So, I was in a really bad band, and we tried to get into the Hot 100 one year, and we just missed out by 2 places. But, we just didn't have enough friends to get us in. People who, I was working at the time, and my band didn't make it on air, so in the Hot 100. So people who say it was rigged, well, unless those people who were theoretically rigging it hated my band, which was probably true as well.
And the other controversy, Triple J going national, well, that came and went.
Triple J changed radically by the time it got to Brisbane. It was no longer the J's that people had known, even the Sydney audience.
And I guess what I was saying was, you really got to play to your strengths, which is being Brisbane. And as long as Triple Z played to its strengths, it would still be fine.
But really, when it came down to it, they just didn't have the money to really realise their dream of having a national network. So at the end, what people were getting really was Sydney radio broadcast around Australia.
But away from the big cities, which did have Triple Z and Triple R and, did have public radio, we probably had an even greater impact in a lot of smaller places. And one moment that really sticks out to me when I was hosting a morning show for a period was, I think someone called up and you could tell by the way they were speaking that they were a little bit nervous, and they were from a city which didn't have public radio, and they had never had programs that they could ring in and talk about things that were relevant to them as young Australians.
I think what we had to focus on was keeping broadcasting, keeping everything on track, and finding somewhere new to live.
And being chucked off campus was one of the best things that could have happened. People look at it as this, this heinous thing, and it was a terrible assault on broadcasting. But in terms of Zed's future, it was one of the best things that could have happened to the station.
How do you think being kicked off campus affected the station in the long run?
That's a very good question. I think it was disastrous at first, but with community support and the strength that Triple Z has, it actually became the making of it. It didn't break us, and now you're still here, you're still going 45 years later.
This podcast was produced across the lands of the Turrbal, Jagera, Yagara and Yugambeh people, and we acknowledge that sovereignty over these lands was never ceded. This episode was produced by me, Max Rowley. I'm a volunteer at 4ZZZ and I host the show Brisbane Line. You can listen online at 4ZZZ.org.au. Executive producers are Grace Pashley and myself. Theme production by Lucy McAfee. Thanks to Stefan, Anita, Andy, Laurie, and also Donna Baines, Gary Williams and Anne Jones. The music you heard was from Batswing Saloon, Pineapples from the Dawn of Time, Razor, Ups and Downs, Regurgitator, Splat Acrobat, Purple Avengers and Screamfeeder. Thanks for letting us fill this episode with great Brisbane music. Go look them up and support independent artists. You can find most of these tracks on the Behind the Banana Curtain compilation. Big thanks to the volunteers who did a ton of archiving work in 2010, digitising reels and reels of tape kept in the basement filing cabinets of 4ZZZ. Make sure you subscribe to From A to Triple Z so you get updates every time we release an episode. We've got a few more to come. This podcast has been produced to tell some of our stories for our 45th birthday. If you like what you hear and want to support community radio for another 4 decades, you can head to 4ZZZ.org.au or visit the links in the show notes to make a donation, buy some merch, or even subscribe.
We want bananas! We want bananas!